Towards the second half of the 1980s, the Soviet government introduced a new policy known as perestroika, which included liberalization of Soviet culture across the board. That also affected religion. It meant that the Soviet government was no longer interested in anti-religious propaganda and instead allowed more religious freedom than ever before. The main beneficiary of this was, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church, the biggest surviving religious organization in Russia, and it manifested in grand celebrations of the 1,000 years since the official introduction of Christianity in ancient Rus that happened in 1988, as well as the growing number of religious literature being published towards the end of the 1980s. And I think that the books are important documents reflecting, documenting this religious revival. This book, this brochure, is a cathist to St. Ambrose of Optina, who was this new 19th century Russian saint, extremely popular both in Russian immigration and in the Soviet Union during the spiritual revival of the 1980s. This particular volume was prepared in 1989 and printed in 1991. As you can see, despite being a new publication, it's written in Church Slavonic and imitates pre-revolutionary Russian publications, thus trying to build a continuity through the Russian Orthodox Church between pre-revolutionary Russia and the future post-Soviet Russia. Russian immigrant communities were also very optimistic about cultural changes happening in the Soviet Union towards the end of the 1980s. They hoped that they also can contribute to this religious revival. They were especially enthusiastic, we are talking about Orthodox communities, about the coming celebrations of the 1,000 years from the official introduction of Christianity in Russia, because it became an important symbol, the symbol of the role of Christianity in Russia, the symbol of cultural change, from prohibition of religion to embracing of religion, specifically of the Russian Orthodox Christianity. And the way the immigrant communities wanted to contribute to this change was by bringing their knowledge of pre-revolutionary Russia, because they really thought about themselves as being the sort of like keepers of pre-revolutionary Russian culture. And a testimony to these efforts is this book, published in New York in 1986, in preparation to the celebrations of these 1,000 years from the introduction of Christianity in Russia. This book is dedicated to a particular temple, the Temple of Christ the Savior in Moscow. Now, the temple itself also was a very important symbol in conversations about religion. The thing is, prior to the 1917 revolution, it was the biggest, the most important Orthodox cathedral in Moscow. It was demolished by the Bolsheviks in the early 1930s, which became the tangible expression, the important symbol of the anti-religious campaigns of the early decades of Soviet history. Now, the temple would only be reconstructed in the 1990s, symboling the restoration of the social role of the Russian Orthodox Church. Back when the book was written, it was still not there. But, again, the absence of this temple was an important symbol. And what this book tries to do, it tries to bring the knowledge about the temple through detailed descriptions and historical photos, basically contributing in a way despite the photos being, of course, accurate and historical, nonetheless contributing to the myth of the Orthodox Russia before the revolution. Because you see, it is not just a book about the cathedral, although it is also the case, but it also situates the conversation about this specific temple within a larger history of Russian monarchy, featuring portraits of the emperors, and overall, again, basically aiming at recreate a certain notion of how the Russia prior to the 1917 revolution looked like. The Russia that for the immigrant communities was the Russia that they had lost and that they hoped to recover after the fall of the Soviet Union, that they hoped would happen soon. In this respect, they were not exactly mistaken.